Good evening everyone and Jai Hind. It's my pleasure to be here today and thank you very much Professor Khan and Mr. Ramachandran for inviting me here today. It is a great honor not only to be releasing this book or having released the book now, but also an honor to address all of you all such a distinguished and august gathering. Beyond Binaries, the world of China and India, 2008 to 2022. This book is a very welcome addition to the body of work which is now dealing with our largest neighbor, but not always very friendly neighbor. The fact that this book has been written by Mr. Ramachandran is also a very great addition, because for very long we have been dependent on our knowledge of China on Western literature. And by Western it could be European, American, Australian, and not so much on what has been written by our own homegrown authors. And of course, when they write what they feel about China, they would definitely have their own perceptions and their own agendas subconsciously. I'm not saying that they have some agenda or axe to grind, but that is bound to happen. And therefore, oftentimes, they may get the China-India equation wrong. And therefore, the importance of having our own thoughts on this subject. Our knowledge of China, as was just brought out, has been a little short and found wanting. And perhaps because of this shortcoming, we have not been able to understand that country properly, because of which perhaps we end up making some wrong assumptions, and based on those wrong assumptions, some wrong decisions. Even within the army, our knowledge of China is more limited to the military aspect, the tactical aspect, the organizations of their various arms and services. What is our bread and butter, but not really so much on the country as a whole and what makes them tick. And I myself actually started looking into China or studying about China when I was posted as a colonel in the perspective planning branch of the army headquarters, and the China account landed on my lap. Otherwise, and that's how I was forced to read about China. I might not have otherwise. I truly believe that to really understand a country, one must have lived and worked there. Also, one must know that language, and only then will we really get to know what that country is all about. Must have friends, local friends, not only among the expat community, local friends from all walks of life. And only when that is part of one's experience will we really be able to talk of any country with any deal of authenticity. And I think in this respect, Mr. Shastri's years spent in China, and of course based on which this book has been written, adds that touch of authenticity to whatever he has written, There is not, as we say, an armchair warrior, but with that amount of field experience. But in the same vein, I must confess that while I am speaking to a room full of China experts, including Mr. Ranade, who has been mentoring me for many years, that I have never been to China. And I doubt I'm going to get an invitation anytime soon. Unless it's a one-way trip. But at the same time, I have visited all the border regions, right from the northern sector, DBO, the area of Eastern Ladakh, Depsang, Demchok, Chumar, central sector, Barahoti, Lipu Lake, the areas to the east, Sikkim, Nakula and Nathula. Everyone has heard of Nathula. Very few would have heard of Nakula, which is also one of the disputed areas. And of course, the rest of Arunachal, right through Asafila, Anini, and on to Kibito. I have also, during my stint as the DA, Defense Attaché in Myanmar, had the opportunity to visit the Myanmar-China border and see how they manage their border issues in a different third country perspective. So by virtue of these on-ground visits and interactions, I do have a different perception of the entire boundary issue, and at the same time you can also understand what are the imperatives and what are the sticking points whenever a boundary question is being discussed. When dealing with China or for any other country for that matter, you will always have people at both ends of the spectrum, the hawks and the doves, the binaries, the zeros and the one. But in our relation with China or any other country for that matter, we cannot be on these extremes. We'll have to follow a middle path, as the Dalai Lama says. And that's where probably the book which has written, Beyond Binaries, seeks to focus our attention. That let us not be caught in this trap of 0 and 1, on and off, friends and enemies, my way or the highway. But let us see where there are points of convergence. And this is mainly what the book focuses on, and as former Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran has written in the foreword, that it gives a more balanced perspective on various facets of China, including the society, aspirations, the leaders, and how the people of the two countries view each other. Our relations with China, of course, have always been a roller coaster ride. From the heyday of Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai to 1962. Thereafter, a long period of perhaps studied indifference, more so from the Chinese side. Then some sort of a rapprochement, a number of summit level meetings, especially in the recent past, between Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi, a slew of agreements and confidence building measures which seem to suggest an upward trajectory in our relations. And one of these was an agreement signed in 2005 called the Agreement on the Political Parameters and Guiding Principles for Settling the China-India border question. And this agreement, in fact, had raised very high expectations that the border question could perhaps be resolved sooner rather than later. But that was not to be, and we had Galwan, and it was back to square one. But that doesn't mean we always have to be at the bottom of the ladder. Relations will always have their ups and downs with anyone for that matter. And as recently as day before yesterday, Senior Colonel Wu Kyong, who was the DG in the Ministry of National Defence on 25th January itself, has said that the boundary dispute is a legacy issue and does not represent the whole picture of bilateral relations. So China too recognizes that there is a scope for an improvement in relations. We must always also remember that India and China have not always been at odds. In the 18th century, we were the world's largest trading partner. It is only later, with the advent of colonialism and as our countries became independent, as we became forced neighbors with the Chinese occupation of Tibet, that these rivalries have come to the fore. Wherever there is commerce, there is bound to be conflict. And wherever there is bound to be competition. And wherever there is competition, there is bound to be conflict. A conflict of interests. And this conflict of interest can be settled through commerce, through discussions, dialogues, trade agreements, or of course through conquest. But that does not mean that hostilities is the first option. It's rather the last option, after all else has failed. And it is in this context that our author makes a very valid point that does trade come first, followed by the flag? Or does the flag go first and trade follows that? And this is a subject which can be debated upon, that which comes first. Though I feel that in this era where national interest is paramount, it is national interest which is driving all else, and trade, commerce and all other activities are just the vehicles by which the national interest is being propagated. And therefore, perhaps in this day and age, it is the flag which is leading the way. Of course, there is no gainsaying that almost everyone recognizes that harmonious relations between China and India is of benefit to the entire world. And not others, but the Chinese too know that. A Chinese analyst, Qiuping Zhu, has said, and I quote, that coexistence is a realistic and worthy goal for relations between the two giants of the two ocean regions. Unquote. This is in the context of the growing Indo-Pacific sphere of influence. And for a Chinese to say that India is a giant is in itself a great admission. I don't know how long he has to live. But it is a growing realization that yes, the two countries have to cooperate, because this conflict, this rivalry does not really serve anyone's purpose. We have all heard about China's rise and how they would like to portray that rise as a peaceful rise and a benign rise. And there are many takers for that view. One of them is Howard French, a correspondent for the New York Times, And he says, a China that is treated as an equal with much to contribute, met with understated but resolute firmness when need be, will mellow as it advances. That is one viewpoint of China's peaceful rise. I have heard similar views being echoed in various other seminars, including one which I attended recently by the ORF, in which one of the speakers said that all China wants is to be acknowledged and recognized as a power, but has no intention of using that power. Even as I say these words, I can see some very cynical smiles in the audience. But everyone is entitled to his view. But there are not many takers for such pronouncements, especially in light of the activities which are going on and the actions that China is doing are not really in tune with what they would like the rest of the world to believe. In his book Stealth War, Robert Spalding elaborates in very great detail how China over the last few decades has very surreptitiously and insidiously infiltrated into almost all countries in the world and infiltrated in these countries in all organs of the government, whether academic institutions, corporate bodies, think tanks. And by virtue of doing this, they have willy-nilly taken control of those institutions and can therefore direct what is put out in the open domain. So much so that even a revered institute like the Chatham House is believed to have been compromised. So if we feel that a very renowned think tank has put out a certain view and that it is an independent view, we might have to take that also with a pinch of salt. And of course, their activities are not borne out by the wolf warrior diplomacy that they have been carrying out and the manner in which they try to coerce especially smaller nations in their neighborhood to toe their line. In this respect, Todd Shesser has this to say. Ideally, a coercer seeks to change the target's behavior without actually having to execute the threat, since doing so can be costly for both sides. And I think that is the key point. It can be costly to both sides, and that is a factor that the smaller countries need to consider when faced with this China challenge, that at some time or the other you have to call the bluff and see whether they are prepared to cross that Lakshman Rekha and actually try to implement those threats. And I do believe that China has more to lose if they do try to take recourse to force in achieving whatever aims they have in mind. I have purposely been presenting two very widely and disparate views, the two ends of the spectrum, the binaries. Because only when we know those two ends will we truly appreciate beyond binaries, the middle path. And that is where this book offers so many more insights into how we need to look at China, our biggest neighbor. And I'm sure that this and many other aspects would form a part of the discussions as we go ahead with today's program. But in that we have to also, and I would like to reiterate that as far as China and India are concerned, we are two big countries, but with totally different systems. Two totally different systems of governance, two totally different cultures, and two different types of leaders and leadership styles. So that will have to be kept in mind as we draw upon the lessons from this book to see how we have to chart the future of our relations with China. At the same time, we have to remember that when we say the Chinese influence, it is not as much the influence of the Chinese people, but the influence of this combination, the combo of the state party, that is the People's Republic of China, as controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And that is what is driving the national policy, not necessarily the will or the interests or the needs of the Chinese people. So we at all times have to be able to distinguish between a government and its people. Thank you very much for your patient hearing, and I look forward to very intellectually stimulating panel discussion. Thank you and Jai Hind.